Quando eu puder começar, em inglês, não é?
Eu preferia o...
Pode ser. Just to clarify.
Olha, só um minuto. Ok, pode começar.
Well, all on board, good morning. My name is Eliana Silva Pereira. I'm a member of the Law of the Sea Research Group at CIIMAR. I was able to conduct almost 2 years of exclusive research dedicated to the topic to the legal regime of marine robotics. This is the name of the report that we published in 2019. The link I sent it previously, so I believe that you can have access to this. Otherwise, I'm very happy to send you the link anyway. This research was carried out within Mindful Project in collaboration with LSTS. So I had a chance to talk with some of your colleagues a little bit older that are working in this area. And at that time, it was a very preliminary research. We started early in 2017, and at that time, just few scholars around the world and very few projects were carried out under this topic. Nowadays, we have gradually more people involved in the research area of legal regime of marine robotics, but still it's a very new area. So even if you try to find information, it's not hard to find. In Portuguese language, for instance, I don't think there's any report available. So what you can expect from this presentation? I'll try to condensate in just 1 hour the main aspects that you should consider when you are dealing with legal issues of marine robotics. It's not possible in such a short session to provide you the full expectations or the full legal regime. First, because it does not exist. Second, the regime that exists is quite complicated, so I will try to simplify it as much as possible. But please, if you have any doubts, I know that you are not familiar with the law issues. Are you all engineering students, right? So do not expect me to give you a full lecture in law. I will try to be as simple as possible, because some of the information is very detailed and it's not worth in discussing here. So basically the summary of this presentation will be this five, six, seven questions. So we're going to start with the terminology and some concept clarifications. This is very relevant for us. I know that I've talked to many people from your research area. Names are not so important, because at the end what matters is how does the device work and if it fits the purpose that it was designed or not. But for us, for those dealing with law issues, concepts and clearly clarifications are very important. So this was, I must say, probably the first hurdle that we faced when we started back in 2017. Then, after that, we're going to talk about maritime zones under the UNCLOS. The UNCLOS is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. This is a very important convention, and the maritime zones degree as well are also very important, because they are necessarily linked to the regime that applies to marine robotics. So it's important at least to have an overview of the areas and the zones and the powers of the coastal and flag states to regulate marine robotics. We're going to see what is a coastal state, what is a flag state, what's the role of each state can play when it comes to regulate marine robotics, and how does the balance of powers work. Then, Before the conclusions, these last three topics, I had them here because I had a look of the thematic areas that we have been discussing during the summer course. And from the lectures I did, it seems to me that it's important that you understand the legal regime of marine robotics in marine scientific research, in archaeology, and in law enforcement activities. I'm going to explain exactly what do we mean by a marine scientific research, what do we mean by archaeology, and what do we mean by law enforcement activities. These are probably concepts that needs to be clarified. And after that, we'll try to wrap up with some conclusions and try to give you some examples of the importance, in one hand, of marine robotics throughout the world. On the other hand, try to give you some examples of regulations that slowly are start being approved worldwide. Once again, if you have any doubts or if you don't understand what I'm saying, please let me know. I'll try to clarify and move forward. So to start with, and maybe you can help me, I would like to ask you, what is a marine robotic from an engineering perspective? So if we were talking outside, having some coffee, and I ask you, what is a marine robotic device? Or how do you classify or define marine robotics? Can you please give me your insights? Just to make sure that we were talking about the same stuff.
I know there is some legislation from the European Union that defines what is the robot, a machine, etc.
That's true.
So it must be a robot under that definition by the EU that works on the sea.
Yeah, but for you, like as an engineering student, forget the legal part. What is a marine robotic device? It's a machine, it's an equipment.
It's autonomous.
It's autonomous. It's necessarily autonomous or is automatic? We're going through that after as well. It must be, or at the first sign, it is a simple question, right? To say, oh, it's a machine, or it's something that you use for different purposes. I actually have here something, let me see. It's a mechanical device that operates automatically or by remote control in the marine environment. This is something that I just Googled. I have others, but I think this is quite simple. So when we do the question from a legal perspective, I think it gets a little bit more complicated. And this was, I passed around 2 weeks trying to find out reports, trying to find out people that could give me some insights and some light on this issue. And it was very hard. So we developed in that report this chart here. This was not invented exclusively by me. No, I based this scheme on CIIMAR. CIIMAR is a best practice guide that was prepared by European Safety Agency. It's available online. It's a technical document. It's not a legal document, and it classifies. It gives an idea of what is a maritime system, which it's also defined by NATO. And so based on the insights that I got from this NATO paper and based on the idea placed in CIIMAR's guideline, I managed to make this. So the central issue here is unmanned maritime systems. So the system is broader than the device, it comprises different things. And this side here, we have vessels, unmanned state vessels and unmanned vessels. So we make a distinction here. Vessels in one way, devices in another. So when we talk to vessels, it's regular vessels like ships, big boats that have cargo and people on board. When they are unmanned, means that they have no persons on board. There's no human presence on board. They can be owned by the state. In this case, we call it unmanned state vessels, or they can be owned by private entities, by companies, by individuals. And in this case, we call it just unmanned vessels. Why do we separate unmanned state vessels from unmanned vessels? Because legally speaking, the legal regime is completely different. So if we move back to this side, we will now have the devices or the vehicles that I believe are the focus of your research of this summer course. So we mostly divided into surface vehicles, which are those are on the surface, underwater vehicles that have the capacity to go underwater and to sail in the water, and then ROVs, which the difference is a ROV is connected to a physical device. I believe you are aware of this. And also aerial vehicles, or as we usually talk, drones, which are normally used. So this was basically the scheme that we used to prepare the report. I believe that for this presentation we was mostly focused on this part and the water vehicles and surface vehicles. But again, if you do some research, you'll probably find other different types of names. Just to give you an example, this is a terminology that was used in a very recent paper that was developed by Professor Natalie Lane from the University of Sydney. It's a law paper, and the first thing that she highlights is that it's extremely hard to define in terms of concepts and clarifications what we are talking about. So she comes up with a very detailed terminology. She includes here as well combat surface vehicles and combat underwater vehicles. These are normally devices used by the Navy or by the military forces, so it's not the scope of this presentation. But just for you to see that there's an array of names that you can use. Probably from a practical perspective for you, it's not important. But if you want to have some insights on the legal regime, the names are quite important. And this was actually the first challenge that we face when we start doing the research, is that you have different names that I use. You can use marine robotic, you can use unmanned maritime vehicle, surface, and the water. And at the end, after the first months of research, it was quite confusing. Because when we want to know which rule applies to this device, you need to have a lot of information on that device. Particularly if it is on the water, surface, if it is boat, what is the capacity of the vehicle? It can be in the water 1 year, it can be 1 day. There's a lot of small things that matter. But once you don't have a uniform terminology, the first challenge starts here. Then there's a big regulatory gap that remains until today. What do I mean by a regulatory gap? If you go out and see most of Portuguese law, for instance, or even some international conventions, the term marine robotics does not appear, it does not exist. It's quite interesting because if you Google it, you will see a lot of web pages with the name marine robotics, and mostly linked to companies, to research centers, that normally are not related to these law issues. If you go deep and if you research the conventions, there's no reference to it. At least the name marine robotics does not exist. In 1972, the UNESCO, you probably know, it's a UN agency, developed this convention. It was a draft convention on the legal status of ocean data acquisition systems, aids, and devices. It was prepared it was prepared by a research group based from people from different countries. They presented it in 72. They made an update in 1993, but still the convention hasn't been approved. I think the solution for marine robotics does not lie in this convention, although this draft convention provides some important tips that might be considered for a future legal regime of marine robotics. It regulates questions like registration, what you should do if the device is lost at sea, what is the responsibility of the research center or the owner that launches the device. Few things, but so far, as I mentioned, the document has no legal status because it's not approved, so you cannot enforce it anyway. You can read it, it's pretty interesting, but it has no practical effect. And so if you consider this is, these are 2 or 3 important hurdles that, whether we want it or not, we always need to address when we need to solve a problem that is related to a marine robotic. On the top of that, we have the level of autonomy. And maybe here you can give me some of your ideas about this. For me, it's particularly hard to understand what is the limits of the device. I've seen some of the devices that LSTS developed, and I also had a chance to go with them to see launching at the ocean and to see some of the devices that they use to control it. Well, I don't understand pretty much what I've seen, to be honest, but it was a very interesting experience. And one of my main questions at that time was, okay, we are here on land, we have our computers, you have this device is going to be launched down the ocean, and after that, do you control it by yourself? Do you guide the device? Is you with your command, with your computer that gives order to the device, and that's it? The device goes, make it works, collect information, send it to the staff on land, and that's it. And then you go and collect it. Or the device you launch has what we call it autonomous, has the capacity to learn and take decisions. Is it the equipment equipped with the sensors, with the technology that enables the equipment to take decisions? Imagine that we have a device that goes in the water and suddenly there's a big rock, or there's a submarine, as you have here in Matosinhos, that is around the area. Does the equipment have capacity to follow this way and go around, or it just crushes the rock? This is very, very, very important when it comes to the legal regime. Because if we are talking about an automatic device, it's just something that I, as a person, use. So I might not be the owner, I might be the one that is just commanding, but there's someone behind the device. So if something goes wrong, or if any kind of responsibility or liability that needs to be addressed, we can certainly go to that person. That person might say, oh, this is not mine. I just work for the Navy, or I just work for a research group. It doesn't matter. But there's a person that can be responsible for the vehicle. When we are talking about autonomous devices, things are quite a little bit more complicated, because a machine, whether it is an unmanned maritime vehicle or is a robot that is now used for many activities, if it has capacity to learn, if it is programmed to learn and to take decision by its own, one can question, should this vehicle be liable for some kind of problem that might happen? The legislation that you mentioned before was one of the topics that was firstly discussed, not regarding to unmanned maritime vehicles, but regarding to artificial intelligence, was the responsibility that a robot might have. A robot is not a legal person. Although sometimes you have robots that look like persons, they can walk, some robots can talk, but they are not a person, they are not a natural person. So they cannot hold responsibilities. And it's very hard. This is a very new area. There are a lot of studies being made, particularly ethical studies that are concerned with the impact that this might have on our society, especially when robots are used for tasks that are normally performed by humans, like medical care, child care, or other stuff. I haven't seen so much attention regarding ethical issues when it comes to the use of maritime robotics at sea, because the question is not so sensitive. But it's still important to address this issue because so far you don't have any answer. If you launch a device and if the device is completely autonomous, you program it, you launch it, it has autonomy, it can go 2 or 3 or 4 days or 5 days, and some problem happen. I'm not saying that you cannot find a legal solution. You can, as you will see in the future, but it's not a very clear solution. It's not you go to a law and the answer is there. No, you need to go all the way around and see what's the international convention, what the powers of the state, which activity the voice is being used. So it's not clear. This is not something that you must be concerned because it's the natural course of the things. This is a very brand new area. So, and normally law always goes slower. So, and the proof of this is drones. Drones exist for a long time, even for military purposes. Aerial drones have been used for many years. And just recently, over the last 5 years, it started getting some attention from the legislators. The European Union was indeed a priority entity. It was concerned with this as a regulation that it was approved, a regulation that applies not only to Portugal, but in all European Union countries. And after that, the Portuguese authorities also passed regulations, but still only after the aerial drones have been playing around for many years, and only after some small accidents occur, that this regulation happens. So it's normal that it takes time. And basically that's it. When it comes to level of autonomy, would you like to give some contributions from your experience in this research, in this summer course? Something that you'd like to add?
Can I just ask a question?
Sure.
Doesn't already regime for autonomous devices, let's say, exist in other areas, for example, regarding autonomous vehicles, the cars, or even in other areas, doesn't it already exist any regime?
As far as I know, when it comes to cars, only Germany has introduced some amendments in legislation in order to allow the industry to develop. The remaining countries, I don't have any information. But my focus of research is not on on cars and trains, but as far as I know, a comprehensive legal framework is not in place. Which does not mean that they are not being tested.
The thing is, wouldn't we expect that the legal regime that is in that area that is also regarding autonomous devices, wouldn't it end up being similar to the legal regime that we could expect in?
No, absolutely. That's why I think this EU regulation that regulates the aerial drones, it's a first step. But normally the way states produce legislation and it depends on the country, but it's normally a very slow procedure because a lot of technical information is necessary, particularly for this topic. If you see the reports, there's a lot of reports available from the European Commission and even from the national parliament that they address technical issues and aspects to be considered while developing laws and regulations. That's true. And we're going to talk about this further in this presentation, but the IMO, which is the International Maritime Organization, has approved in 2017 the creation of a working group that is responsible for doing, they call it a scoping exercise on the legal regime of autonomous vessels. So we have now a lot of more attention given to this purpose. So it's expected that, I hope, over the next 5 years, something will come up. But so far, everything is very short, and I think we need the country to start first, because sometimes once a country starts or once an institution starts, all the others go as well. But the first country that fully regulates maritime systems, and particularly unmanned maritime vehicles, whether they are underwater or surface, I don't know any.
But we are talking only about our European partners, or we
No,
are
no,
considering
worldwide.
Worldwide.
Worldwide. I don't have any. Even if you research, I've been in contact with an international network of experts in the legal area, and we haven't shared any information on this issue. So, if by any chance you know something, please let me know. I would love to see. But so far, I think the regime is pretty much close to zero. But as I told you, it does not necessarily mean that regulations do not apply. They do apply, but you need to know where you can find such regulations. And the first place to start with is the United Nations Conventions on the Law of the Sea. This is a very comprehensive and complex convention. It was negotiated during 9 years. It was approved in 1982, and it basically establishes the main legal regime that applies to activities, resources, and protection of the ocean. It's a very interesting convention, and one of the most important aspects that unfold from this convention is the maritime zones. Maritime zones are basically areas in the maritime environment, areas in the ocean, that are divided like borders. And we have areas under national sovereignty or jurisdiction, in maritime areas or maritime zones behind national sovereignty and jurisdiction. To simplify, areas under national jurisdiction are areas that the state that borders the ocean have powers. Zones beyond national sovereignty, they don't belong to any state. This is the main idea, and we can actually easily see it here. Imagine that this is the land, right? This is the beach, for instance, to see it in a simple way. We have the territorial sea, is a 12 nautical mile belt from the baselines, and then if you go 24 miles out, you will have another zone called continuous zone. If we continue until 200 miles, you will have the exclusive economic zone. And this is just the water column. You see here, this low line. If you go deep, if you go to the bottom, you will find the continental shelf. So the territorial sea, the continuous zone, the exclusive economic zone, and the continental shelf are areas under national sovereignty or jurisdiction. Beyond that areas, we have the high seas and the deep sea bed, or the area. Area is a technical name that refers to the ocean floor besides the areas under national jurisdiction. So this is here, does not belong to the states. From here, the states have some power. What's the complicated thing about this chart? The powers that the state holds are not the same in these areas. So the closer we are to the land, the stronger the powers are. So if I'm at the territorial sea, the powers of the state are very strong because the ocean is pretty close to the land. Traditionally, is an area where the state can exercise powers as they do in land. What I can do in land, I in principle can do in the ocean up to 12 nautical miles. That one exception, which is called the right of innocent passage, means that I will give you a practical example so it's easy to understand. If a vessel that belongs to France or to Brazil decided to cross the territorial sea of Portugal, In principle, this crossing is allowed, unless the vessel might affect the security or might create some problems to the coastal state. In principle, the coastal state cannot prohibit vessels to cross the territories. But besides that, coastal state can regulate whatever it wants, can impose condition it wants, which is not the same once we start moving the 12 nautical miles away. When you start entering into the continuous zone, the powers of the straits are getting smaller. And in the continuous zone, the state can only control issues regarding immigration, sanitary, fiscal, and custom issues. Only these 4 areas can be regulated. All the rest, in principle, the state cannot regulate. If you move forward to the exclusive economic zone, the powers gradually start being blurred. So the state has jurisdiction when it comes to the exploration and exploitation of natural resources. So the state can fish, can look for oil and gas, wind farms, and so on. The state has powers. It also has powers when it comes to regulate marine scientific research, which is important for the session, to install artificial islands, for instance, and also to protect the marine environment. If you go to the bottom floor, the difference is that in principle, any activity that uses marine robotics or interferes with the bottom of the continental shelf needs to be authorized by the state. Why? Because the coastal state has powers and has exclusive jurisdiction over the resources that lie here in the continental shelf, notably mineral resources, petrol, oil and gas, and so on. So the state needs to authorize any type of activity that is carried out in the continental shelf. But besides that, in principle, all the states can do other things that do not interfere with this exploration of natural resources. Once you go to the high seas, well, the main principle you probably have heard is the freedom of the high seas. In principle, if you are in the high seas, you can do whatever you want because obviously that there are some rules that apply. But in principle, activities are free. Marine scientific research is free. Fishing, overflight, put pipelines, cables, whatever, is everything free. In the area, in the seabed, it depends. Have you heard about the International Seabed Authority? It's an authority that has headquarters in Jamaica, and it's basically an authority that was created to take care of the area. The resources of the area are considered by this convention as being part of the mankind, so they belong to all of us. As a result, they decided that an authority should be in place to protect these resources and to ensure that they are equally shared by mankind. So this International Seabed Authority has a lot of powers and competences when it comes to the activities carried out in the area, but only when it comes to the mineral resources, including polymetallic nodules. If we are talking about living resources, this authority has no powers. And this is the reason why, as you can imagine, and you probably understand this better than I, living resources at the ocean are very used for bioprospecting. So a lot of industries are using materials collected from the ocean, not only the ocean floor, but I'm sorry. I had no idea that this was. But at this moment, collecting of living resources from the area is free. Anyone can do it because the convention, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, does not regulate it. That's why there's a new international convention being discussed at this moment. The group was established a couple of years ago, since 2006, if I'm not mistaken. There's a long way being developed over the last years that recommended the states to adopt a new convention. This might be something that can affect the use of marine robotic devices for collecting living resources in the area, but the convention is still being drafted, so we're not going to move forward because there's still a lot of things to be defined before we can ascertain the legal regime applicable. So once we have this big picture, I know that it's complicated for the first time if you just heard these names right now. Too much areas, I know. But what I think is important for you to retain is that if you by any chance are involving in some kind of activity that uses a maritime device that is being launched in the ocean, please make sure that you know in which area you're going to deliver it. This is very important. Because if you deliver on the high seas, there's still some rules apply, but it's completely different than if you deliver it on the territorial sea because rules are different. And that's here that it comes the powers of the coastal states and the flag states. Coastal states are easy to understand what they are countries that border the ocean. Portugal is a coastal state because we have the ocean right down there. Switzerland is a landlocked state because it doesn't have any ocean. Flag states is a different concept because a flag state is a state that grants its flag to a vessel that is registered under its laws. Any of you have any boats? No. Okay, but if you have your boat, you need to register the boat. If you have a big company and you use a big vessel to go fishing, you need to have the documents for the boat, right? It's like having a car. So in the place where you register your vessel, the country where you register your vessel, it's called flag state. It's called flag state because for a vessel to be able to sail in the ocean, you need to have a flag. If you go there, if you go to the ocean, you will see different flags. This is the concept of flag state. If you see a vessel that is flagged with a Spain vessel, you see that that vessel is registered in principle in Spain. So why this is important? Because coastal states have powers, as I mentioned before, to regulate activity in the territorial sea, but flag states also have powers. Because if I want to regulate, if I want to register a vessel in Portugal, I have to comply with the Portuguese legislation. And why this is relevant for marine robotics? It's very relevant. Not now, because you don't have any laws, but it's going to be relevant in the future. Imagine that I've seen some marine robotic devices that are like probably a little bit bigger than this table. And I know that a few problems were already reported. Sometimes they can just hit a vessel, sometimes it just can break. And how do you know to whom that device belongs? If you don't have any registration system, it's hard to know where they belong. If they are in the territorial sea, you can try, I don't know, you can try to find out throughout law enforcement agents or something, but if you find a device in the middle of the ocean, how do you know to whom they belong? They need to belong to someone, right? They're not made by magic. But so far, the rules are not very clear. So one of the things that is discussed is whether or not a registration should be mandatory. Because for vessels they are, no doubt. Even if you have a small surface underwater vehicle, the Portuguese law requires that they are registered, unless if they are small than a certain dimension and they can be placed inside other vessels. In this case, there's no registration needed because it's like you have the boat is inside of the boat and the other boat has a flag, it's okay. This is what we have in the Portuguese law. But our law, it's not very updated, unfortunately. The main legislation that applies was drafted in 1972, 1972. This is not a mistake, this is true. Obviously that the legislation has been updated, but it still needs a lot to be developed, particularly to consider the technologies that are being used at the ocean. So that's why it's important for you to know the meaning of flag state, because you need to know which country your devices belong to. So that's important at this stage. So please always bear in mind that when a country, whether it's a coastal state or a flag state, passes laws and regulations regarding marine robotics, it always needs to comply with the regulations under the UNCLOS. It's like the UNCLOS is an overarching regime that the countries have to respect in order to approve regulations in this regard. Other aspect that is very important is the activity that is involved. Well, we don't have any legal convention, or in Portugal, we don't have any legal document that approves the legal regime that applies for marine robotics. However, as I told you earlier in this presentation, we can find some legal regime that applies, but for that, we need to consider the activity that is involved. And that's why I think this slide is very important for your summer course. Do you know what is marine scientific research? Any of you have any idea? Well, from the class you had, you certainly got the idea, at least from the research I did, that devices are out there in the ocean, they collect information, right? This can be classified as marine scientific research. The convention does not give any definition what is marine scientific research, but it's normally, I would say, collect information from the ocean, data that allows you to know the ocean better. You want to know information on salinity, climate change implications on the oceans, temperature. You need to collect information, and you can use marine robotics to collect that information. So when you use a device to be used to produce knowledge, to produce information regarding the ocean, you are using a marine robotic for marine scientific research. And marine scientific research is deeply regulated in the convention and is also regulated under the Portuguese law. So, and we call it, at least the name that is placed in the UNCLOS and the Portuguese law is equipment. So it's an equipment that we use to collect information in the ocean. So, and under the UNCLOS, once you deliver this equipment to the ocean, there are some rules that you have to observe. First, they not create any legal rights. You launch a device, you collect them, that's it. You cannot do any claim using the device. You cannot interfere with shipping rules. If you know that under that coordinates there are ships crossing, please don't go there, because otherwise you can create any problem. I don't think it's necessary we go through all of this because the presentation will be available, but the idea is that, just 2 points I'd like to clarify. The identification mark is in warning signals. The convention says that if you launch a device, the device should have identification markings. What is the idea? Is some kind of letters or numbers or something that allows you to identify the owner of the device. And also warning signals. Signals, lights, some kind of sound. The idea is try to avoid any collision at sea. So if you respect this, in principle, you can use a marine robotic in your research. it doesn't necessarily mean that this use is free. Not that simple. You need to prepare a research project. That's normally the research team that produces, and you draft a document, and in that document you need to identify the methods of research. And if you are using a marine robotic device, you need to identify the device there. This is mandatory, either under the clause, either under the Portuguese law. And then, whether you can launch it or not without authorization, it depends. It depends on the maritime zone you launch it. If you launch it in the territorial sea, please make sure that you have an authorization. If you launch it in the EEZ and on the continental shelf, it depends. It depends for the purpose of the information that you are collecting. If you are collecting information just to expand the knowledge of the ocean, we call it pure marine scientific research. In this case, in principle, the coastal state should give you authorization. But if you are using information, for instance, looking for resources, fishing resources, oil and gas, mineral resources, if you want to use a marine robotic to drill into the continental shelf, well, in principle, the state can say no. So have these two positions. Portuguese legislations, well, freedom of the high seas. If you go to the high seas, as I mentioned, you can do your research. If you go to the area, you need to consult with the International Seabed Authority and say, we have a research project. This research project will use a marine robotic device, so please give us as an authorization. This only applies if we are talking about mineral resources. If it is living resources, no authorization is needed. The Portuguese legislation, well, it's clear, but the main distinction that it's important for you at this stage to be aware is that if you want to use part of the ocean to do your research, and that part is not exclusively for you, you still need an authorization, but you don't need a title for the private use of the ocean. It's easier to obtain. If you want to use a large area of the ocean, or even if it's a small area, is it just for you? You want to close the area and you don't want anyone to go there and fish and do other activities. In this case, you will need a special licensing. The name is TUPEM in Portuguese. It's titled for the private use of the marine environment under a legal regime approved in 2015. You probably have heard about it. It's maritime special planning regulations that oblige you to apply for this position. As far as I know, the research that was carried out under the Marinfo project didn't have any problems with the authorizations. It was a very simple procedure. The use of marine robotics in archaeology. This is a new area for me. It was something that we didn't cover in the report. The regime is a little bit different, and the first thing to mention is that archaeology and the research that you can conduct in order to find underwater cultural heritage, it's not the same as marine scientific research. Legally speaking, there are two different realities. The UNCLOS is very poor when it comes to regulate this issue. Just two articles talk about underwater cultural heritage, is 149 and 303. These were introduced at the end of the discussion of the convention, so the idea was just to mention and then leave it to another convention to regulate issue. That regulation happened in 2001 when UNESCO approved the Convention on the Protection of the Underwater Cultural Heritage. This convention, it has some words on the importance of technology when it comes to discover and to recover underwater cultural heritage. But what would say that it's important from your perspective, is the Annex 1 that provides rules concerning activities directed at underwater cultural heritage. So it mostly says that the equipment or the materials that are used should be non-intrusive. And why? Because the idea of this convention is to protect the underwater cultural heritage, is to give them the same protection as the objects found on land. So obviously it's more complicated to find objects underwater and even to preserve them if you compare to the works that are carried out on land. So the convention was driven by this concern. All the equipment, all the methods that are used should be properly designed and prepared to preserve the objects found. So these rules, the annex, are quite interesting from a technical perspective. So if you have any curiosity, I think it will be helpful for you to see them. Besides that, we still have the zonal approach. The system here is not as strong as, it is more flexible than the regime established in the UNCLOS. Not in the territorial sea and the contiguous zone, because in these areas, in principle, states needs to authorize, give consent, and so on. But when it comes to the other areas, the convention created a cooperation mechanism. The idea is that if someone that goes out in the ocean using a vessel finds some kind of underwater cultural heritage, it needs to communicate it immediately. It needs to communicate it to the state. Imagine that you go on a research boat and you manage to find in the EEZ underwater device. So immediately you need to communicate it to the state. And the state to Portugal, if you are in the territorial sea of Portugal. If you are in Spain, you have to communicate to Portugal and to Spain as well. And the states then have to communicate to the DG of UNESCO. And then the start that discovered the underwater cultural heritage, it's normally the coordinating state, I'm sorry. The idea is to use is that these three states or more even can create a mechanism ultimately aimed at protecting the maritime sites. When we are talking about the archaeology in the area, in principle, this communication needs to be done also to the International Seabed Authority. But in principle, you can use marine robotics, and they are highly recommended in archaeology. If you are presenting a project under the Portuguese laws, the legal requirements of the project are not so detailed in the law as in marine scientific research, but you still need to identify what type of devices you are using. So I recommend you to put the details of the device in the research project, because this should be analyzed by a technical team and then approved along with the project. We don't have much time. I just wanted to give some insights on the law enforcement activities. Basically, a law enforcement activity is an activity where the states can enforce its laws. It normally carried out by the police, by the Navy, by the armed forces. It's something that it's hard to do at the ocean, because you need to have boats that go to patrol the ocean, trying to detect some illegal activities. So this is an area that, from my research, it will be very useful. The developments that marine robotics have been observing over the last years. There are a lot of steps, there are a lot of countries that are now using not only underwater devices, but also aerial drones, and a combination of aerial drones with regular forces to inspect their laws. And is that legal from an UNCLOS perspective? Well, the UNCLOS does not regulate in principle, at least does not fully regulate the powers of the state regarding enforcement of these laws. But it does have some points that are related to the use of force in the ocean against vessels flying a flag of foreign states. The most important one is the right of hot pursuit. Hot pursuit permits a country that finds a vessel on its territorial sea, and that vessel is illegally fishing. Okay, we have a vessel from the state that can go to that official vessel and ultimately arrest the persons on board. But if meanwhile that vessel just flies out to the high seas, the Portuguese authorities cannot go there unless it continues going behind the vessel and find it. There's a lot of scholars saying that this type of devices can be very useful for this purpose. So instead of having a big vessel that takes more time to go, that normally requires persons on board, and in terms of energy is also very consuming, you can have small devices that can go alone, going against this vessel and trying to stop them. You will need to have a flexible interpretation of the UNCLOS, but I must say that it's pretty much accepted in the law groups that this is possible. So before we sum up, I have here some practical examples of how marine robotics have been used over the last years. In 2006, a Chinese Navy seized a marine robotic device from the United States, where in the EEZs of the Philippines, it created a big diplomatic problem, and the resolution was the United States defended that drone, that maritime drone as they call it, belongs to the US Navy, so it has immunity, and China was basically accepted and released the drone. But also, in 2017, 2 remote control boats were used for terrorist activities. So we can also have this side of the coin. A lot of these devices can also be used for illegal activities, and this has been taking place at least twice. But also the good news: 2 boys were rescued by a surface maritime robotic device in Australia. So they were having problems. They were getting down to the ocean, and immediately the guys on land would check it and launched a surface marine robotic that were able to rescue the 2 boys. In Singapore, in a meeting, Singapore, Japan, and South Korea also announced that they are going to start using marine robotics to surveillance, like fishing, search and rescue, coast and border patrols. Also, Palau, Belize, and Seychelles are also using aerial drones to control fishing boats. So I think that's from a practical perspective, there's a lot of uses that you can implement marine devices. Legally speaking, just these ideas. We don't have much. If you have any curiosity, Australia Fisheries Management Act in 2017 had an amendment, basically in order to allow law enforcement agents to use any type of technology that is available to conduct surveillance and enforcement activities. This is very important from a legal perspective, because when things go wrong and you have to go to the court, it's very important to have a law that clarifies the powers that law enforcement agents can have and the devices that they can use to collect proof and evidence, which sometimes is a problem. As I mentioned, the IMO also created a working group that was aimed to study the legal implication of autonomous vessels. Last year, they published the guidelines. That group published the guidelines. From a legal perspective, they are not very relevant, but for technical ones, they are quite interesting. If you want, it's very easy to find online. I can also send you if you need. And at the end, this regulation that was just mentioned as well for unmanned aircrafts, obviously it's not the same. The regulations are not the same. The oceans have different characteristics if you compare to the air, but it's a first step. It's a first step. So I believe that the next years some kind of regulations will also come up for unmanned maritime vehicles. I have no doubt, because only once the problems and opportunities starts appearing, the legislator thinks, oh, maybe it's important we regulate this better. So far, the regime is not straightforward, but you can still find some solutions, mainly depending on the activity. So what I would recommend you, if you someday have to deal with this question, is first, identify the device you have. If it is a underwater, if it is a surface, if it's a ROV, whatever. Make sure that you know the device you are using. Second, where are you going to deliver it? Territorial sea, exclusive economic zone, continental shelf, high seas area. That's relevant. Then, see if the coastal state or the flag states have some kind of regulations. And to finish, for what activity are you using the device? If you answer these 4 questions, it's easy to define the legal regime you have. You might not have the legal regime complete, but at least you have some insights and you know where to find the answer to your question. And this was pretty much what I have to say. Please make me some questions, give me some insights.
I have a question, but it's not going to be related to maritime robotics.
No problem.
It's about the deep sea. You talked a lot about how biological resources, or as we like to call them, living beings, are not regulated on the deep sea. If, say, a specific species is problematic and starting to miss and probably going to become extinct.
Oh, that's a big problem.
Yeah. Do they regulate it at that point? For example, Japan may have some regulations against fishing tuna in their economic zone, but can they regulate that in the deep sea?
No. That's a very important question. States can only regulate any issue. Fishing, mining, oil and gas, protection of marine environment in areas beyond national jurisdiction. Let me go back here.
But is there any entity that enforces just life preservation and things like that?
So, you are talking about the area, the deep sea.
Yeah.
The area is under the authority of the International Civil Authority. So this authority has powers to pass regulations. What is the problem? Is when the UNCLOS was prepared, you started the process of negotiations in the 70s, finished 82. At that time, there were few research and proofs that living resources could exist underwater. Now it is clear for all of us. We know hydrothermal vents and so on. So we know that it's possible for a fish to live without the sun. But at that time, it was not that clear. So when the UNCLOS was drafted, it regulated only mining resources. So when it comes to living resources, at this stage, no one has powers to regulate it. Here in the deep sea or the high seas, only flag states. I'm a flag state and you are a vessel and you want to do some kind of activity in the area. In principle, it's free, but if you are from my nationality, and if you hold my flag, I might be able to impose you some rules. But that's not very common. So that's why this new agreement in New York is being prepared. Because scholars, scientists, decision makers, and not concluding that, there's no one protecting the biodiversity on high seas. In fact, there's no one. So that's why you have also many companies doing lobby that they don't want to have this regulated, because now it's free, so we can go there, grab it, and it's ours. We can develop our chemical products without paying anything. So that's why this new convention is being regulated. But so far, no. So far, you're right. It's that's the situation we have. No, the convention will not fix all problems, but it's a first step. It's a first step. If you're talking about living resources in these areas, the exclusive economic zone, you see, the postal state has powers to pass legislation. Yes. Please.
Our exclusive economic zone.
Sorry, I can't hear you. Sorry.
Our exclusive economic zone will grow next year, right? Or is expected to grow?
It's not the exclusive economic zone, it's the continental shelf. Extension of the continental shelf. Is this area here, the bottom floor. The EEZ, or exclusive economic zone, is 200 nautical miles. And what you can extend is the continental shelf, is the bottom. You can extend it, that's why, if you see here is 200 nautical miles, and in this scheme here, you have this place, right? This place is the area that can be extended. That's a process called extension of the continental shelf. It's a procedure that is regulated under the clause that enables states to present a report to the Commission on the limits on the continental shelf, where they give information, and they give, it's a lot of technical information, where they can prove that the national territory extends up to a certain level that goes beyond the 200 nautical miles. It's a very long process. Many countries around the world have presented their claims. Portugal is one of them. And we don't know when the Commission is going to decide, but it will certainly take 5 or more years, because it's very complex, and the process is like that. You present a report, you have technical staff from different countries. We have a Portuguese in the Commission. I think he's an engineer, if I'm not mistaken, Alvino Campos. Yeah, I think he's an engineer. And basically, they analyze the process, they make reports, and they give it back to the country if they have any doubts. And it's like this process back and forward until they decide on the limits. But it's the continental shelf, not the EEZ. You please?
Yeah, my question is regarding the 5 states. So how restricted are the universal rules? Because, for example, in other situations, for example, when registering companies and all that, there's some fiscal paradise, let's say. So regarding flag state, is it also like is there any country which has a more, let's say, better law in terms of?
Well, that's a very smart question. Basically, the powers of the coastal state and the flag state are limited under the clause. If you are a coastal state, you have to comply with that zoning. In the territorial sea, you can only do small things and so on. But the flag states have the power to impose rules and regulations on their nationals in all of these areas. So in this way, it's a little bit broader. It's bigger. Because if I'm Portuguese and if I have a vessel that is flagged with a Portuguese vessel, and the Portuguese state enacts a lot of regulation that applies to me, I have to comply with it, regardless I'm in the territorial sea or I'm on the high seas. And this is relevant when it comes to marine robotics, because rules regarding design, construction, and many equipment of marine robotics can only be passed by the flag states or by they call it GARE, so generally accepted international rules and regulations that are normally developed by the IMO. So rules regarding constructions, only the flag state can impose, coastal states cannot.
So are there any countries like, I don't know, Panama or something like that, that people would rather register their vehicles there so that they have advantage?
Yeah, this is very useful for vessels. Liberia, Panama, and are the biggest countries when it comes in terms of registration. If you want to register a vessel in Liberia or in Panama, you go there, you pay the fees, you register. The registration procedure is simple. Normally in European countries you have more regulations. It's harder and sometimes it's more expensive as well. But we don't know if this reality is going also to apply to unmanned maritime vessels. That's a very good question. If all states start imposing that registration is mandatory, probably some rules will be tighter, other rules will be, I don't know, more simple. We'll see. No more questions? Well, if you need any clarification or any topic that you would like to address, please send me an email. I'm very happy to answer. And thank you again for this opportunity, and thank you very much for being here. Okay. 5 minutos.